The snow fell without mercy. It wasn't the gentle kind that belongs in postcards. This snow came with wind. It came with ice. It came with a cold so sharp it felt like it could slice straight through cloth, skin, and bone. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, American soldiers crouched in frozen foxholes, their breath rising in small white clouds. Their hands were stiff, their boots were soaked, their fingers barely worked, and still they waited. Because the artillery never truly stopped. Even when the guns went quiet for a few minutes, everyone knew it could start again at any second. A distant thump, a whistle. Then the earth would shake as steel tore through the trees. It was December 22nd, 1944. The town of Bastogne was surrounded. Every road leading in was cut off. Every road leading out was watched. The men inside weren't just fighting enemy soldiers, they were fighting hunger, exhaustion, frostbite, fear, and one more thing, time. Then, out of the white haze, movement appeared. At first, it looked like shadows shifting between the trees, a small group, walking slowly, carefully. The Americans raised their rifles, but the figures kept coming, and when they stepped closer, something strange became visible through the snowfall. A white flag, then another. German officers. They were unarmed, calm, almost polite, and in their hands they carried a typed letter, sealed, official, and heavy with meaning. The message was simple: surrender or be destroyed. They promised overwhelming artillery, total annihilation. They even offered what they called humane treatment if the Americans laid down their weapons. The Germans believed they held all the cards. They believed the Americans had no food left, no ammo left, no hope left. And they believed the reply would be obvious. But inside Bastogne, an American general was about to read that letter and answer it with one word, a word that would become legend. Bastogne wasn't a famous city. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a capital. Most people had never even heard its name before the winter of 1944. But the men fighting there understood one truth very quickly. This town wasn't important because of what it was. It was important because of what it controlled. Bastogne sat in the Ardennes region of Belgium, surrounded by forests, hills, and narrow roads. In peaceful times, it was a quiet crossroads town, small, ordinary, easy to overlook. But in war, crossroads are everything. 7 major roads met in Bastogne like spokes on a wheel. And in December 1944, those roads became the arteries of an entire battle. Germany's final gamble in the West had begun. Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, hoping to smash through the Allied lines, split the American and British armies apart, and force a negotiated peace before the Allies could crush Germany completely. For the first few days, the attack worked. The weather was terrible. Low clouds, heavy snow, no visibility. Allied aircraft were grounded. American units were caught off guard. Some were shattered, others pushed back in confusion. German armor rolled forward, hungry for fuel, racing against time. They weren't just trying to win a battle. They were trying to win the war before it was too late. And to keep moving, they needed the roads. They needed Bastogne. Because without Bastogne, German tanks would have to slow down and detour through narrow, icy forest routes that could choke an entire army into a traffic jam. Without Bastogne, their supply lines would stretch thin, their fuel trucks would fall behind, and their momentum would die in the snow. But if they captured Bastogne, they could flood through the crossroads, swing west toward the Meuse River, and open a path to Antwerp, the great Allied supply port. That was the dream. That was the plan. And that's why the Germans wrapped their forces around the town like a tightening fist, because they believed Bastogne was a locked door, and they believed one brutal ultimatum would open it. But what the Germans hadn't fully understood was this. Inside that frozen ring were men who had already decided something. If Bastogne fell, the offensive could live. If Bastogne held, the offensive could break. The Americans in Bastogne didn't arrive like a conquering army. They arrived like a fire brigade, rushed in, half-equipped, thrown into position wherever the flames were hottest. The 101st Airborne Division had been resting in France. Many of the men still believed they might spend Christmas somewhere warm, far behind the front. Instead, They were loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night and driven straight into the storm. No time for planning, no time for proper maps, no time for full supplies. They reached Bastogne and immediately began digging into frozen ground with whatever they could find. Shovels, bayonets, even bare hands. The earth was so hard that every scrape sounded like metal on stone. And while they dug, German artillery searched for them, raking the edges of town, pounding the roads, shattering trees into splinters. Within days, the ring closed. German forces spread across every approach, cutting the highways, capturing surrounding villages, and turning Bastogne into an island of American resistance in the middle of a sea of enemy troops. Inside the perimeter, the reality became brutal. Food was rationed down to almost nothing, a few bites of cold rations, some watery coffee if there was fuel to heat it. A man could feel hunger like an ache in his bones, but the cold was worse. The cold stole strength. It stiffened joints. It made every movement slower. It turned sweat into ice, then turned that ice into pain. Frostbite spread like an invisible disease. Men pulled off their gloves, and within minutes their fingers went numb. Weapons jammed. Bolts froze. Machine guns became useless until someone could warm them with body heat. And there was no rest. Sleep came in fragments, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there, always waking to the sound of shell fire or to the shout of a runner bringing new orders. Worst of all were the wounded. Bastogne's aid stations filled until there was no room to walk. Men lay in barns, basements, churches, anywhere there was a roof to keep the snow off their faces. Doctors worked with half the supplies they needed. Morphine ran low, bandages ran low, plasma ran low. Some operations were done by flashlight, some amputations were done with the surgeon's breath fogging the air, and through it all, the weather stayed locked. Low clouds, thick snow, no sun. That meant no airplanes, no bombers to hit German positions, no fighters to strafe the roads, no transport planes to drop food or ammunition. The men in Bastogne were alone, cut off, surrounded, and squeezed tighter. Every day, German loudspeakers sometimes called out across the snow. They promised surrender would be easy. They warned that resistance was hopeless. They offered warm food, dry beds, and survival. But the Americans could also hear something else in the distance. German engines, tanks shifting in the forest, the grinding sound of armored tracks. And they understood the truth. The Germans weren't just waiting for them to starve. They were preparing to crush them. Bastogne was becoming a pressure cooker, and every hour the lid stayed on made the next explosion more violent. In a siege, weapons matter, ammunition matters, food matters. But above all, one thing matters more than anything else: leadership. Because when men are cold, starving, exhausted, and surrounded, they don't just look for orders. They look for certainty. They look for someone who can take the chaos and turn it into a plan. In Bastogne, that responsibility fell on a man who wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, was away in the United States on staff duty when the German offensive exploded. So the division's artillery commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, suddenly found himself in charge. McAuliffe wasn't the kind of general who loved the spotlight. He wasn't famous. He didn't speak in grand poetry. He didn't carry himself like a movie hero. He was practical, a soldier's soldier, the kind of commander who asked where the ammo was, and what road was still open, and how many wounded could be moved before the next shelling. And now, in Bastogne, every answer was bad. The perimeter was fragile. The units were scattered. Some companies were holding thin lines with barely enough men to fill the foxholes. The artillery, normally the division's greatest strength, was firing so much that barrels were wearing out and shells were being rationed the same way. Food was rationed. Every time a gun fired, it had to count. Every time a rifle cracked, it had to matter. McAuliffe moved constantly, checking positions, listening to reports, making decisions that had to be right the first time. If he shifted a battalion to one side of the perimeter, another side might collapse. If he held his men too long in one place, German armor might punch through somewhere else. His job wasn't to win with style. His job was to survive. And in those days, survival wasn't heroic. It was painful. It was calculation. It was forcing exhausted men to hold when every instinct told them to fall back. Still, McAuliffe kept his tone calm. He didn't promise miracles. He didn't tell his men that help was coming tomorrow. He told them the truth. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered. But they were going to hold, because if Bastogne broke, the entire front could break with it. And in that frozen town, with shells falling like thunder, one thing became clear. The Germans weren't just trying to crush an American position. They were trying to break an American will. And McAuliffe understood something many commanders never learn. In war, the mind collapses before the body does. So he held the line, inside his own headquarters first. He projected certainty. He forced order onto chaos, and while the snow piled higher outside, McAuliffe prepared for the next move, because he knew it was coming. The Germans would not accept delay forever. Sooner or later, they would demand surrender. It happened in the morning, when the cold felt sharpest. Not long after sunrise, word came in that German officers were approaching the American lines under a white flag. In war, a white flag can mean many things. Sometimes it means a prisoner exchange. Sometimes it means a request to retrieve the wounded. Sometimes it means someone wants to talk. But in Bastogne, everyone understood what it really meant. The Germans believed the siege was reaching its final stage. They believed the Americans had been crushed down to the point of surrender. So the messengers were brought in. 2 German officers and a third man, carrying the letter, walked through the snow and into the American perimeter. Their coats were heavy and clean. Their posture was controlled. They did not look like desperate men. They looked like men delivering the end of a story. They were escorted into Bastogne, toward the headquarters of the 101st Airborne. Inside, the staff was working in cramped rooms, hunched over maps, listening to radios that crackled with bad news from the front. Then, the Germans handed over the document. It was typed, formal, polite, almost respectful, and it was ruthless. The letter declared that the town was completely surrounded by German forces. It claimed the Americans had no way out and no way to survive. Then it offered terms. If the Americans surrendered within 2 hours, they would be treated fairly. But if they refused, the Germans would open fire with everything they had: artillery, mortars, tanks. The ultimatum promised destruction so complete it sounded like a certainty, not a threat. And at the end of the letter was a line meant to cut straight into the mind of every commander who read it: resistance is useless. For a moment, the room went quiet. Not because the Americans were afraid of dying. They already knew death was close. The silence came from something else: the audacity, the assumption, the German confidence that the Americans would simply fold. One of the officers watched the faces around him as if waiting for the inevitable answer. And then someone said, "We need to wake the general." McAuliffe was in a nearby building, exhausted, catching the first real sleep he had managed in days. A runner shook him awake and told him the Germans were demanding surrender. McAuliffe sat up slowly, still half in the fog of sleep, and asked one question. "What?" The letter was handed to him. He read it once, then again, and as the meaning sank in, he didn't shout. He didn't panic. He didn't even hesitate. He looked up at his staff and said what came naturally, a short sentence, half a mutter, half a verdict. "Aw, nuts." And in that instant, the Germans' carefully written ultimatum met something they had not expected. Not fear, not negotiation, not surrender, just disbelief and defiance. For a second, no one in the room moved. McAuliffe's words, "Aw, nuts," hung in the air like steam in the cold. Then the tension cracked. A few officers laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was relief. Pure relief. The kind you feel when someone finally says what everyone is thinking. Because the truth was, the Germans were asking for the impossible. Surrender didn't mean comfort. It meant defeat. It meant abandoning the wounded. It meant handing over the town that held the entire crossroads of the Ardennes. And everyone in that headquarters knew it. But now the problem was practical. A German officer was waiting outside with a formal ultimatum. The Americans needed a formal answer. One of McAuliffe's staff officers looked at him and said, "Sir, what do we send back?" McAuliffe didn't blink. He didn't search for the perfect phrase. He didn't reach for a speech. He simply repeated the first word that had come out of his mouth. Nuts. The room went still again, this time in surprise, because it was so short, so blunt, so unmistakably American. Someone asked, "Sir, do you mean that as the official reply?" McAuliffe nodded. "Yes." So they typed it, one word, all caps, nuts. They folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and handed it to an American officer assigned to deliver it back through the lines. A few minutes later, the Americans walked the German messengers out to the edge of the perimeter. The snow was still falling. The air still burned your lungs. And there, in that frozen no-man's land between armies, the Germans were handed their answer. They opened the envelope. They stared at the page. And for a moment, they didn't move at all. Because they had expected surrender. They had expected fear. They had expected negotiation. They did not expect one word that meant, in plain language, no, not now, not ever. The German officers stood there in the snow, holding the paper like it was a mistake. They read it once, then again. One word. Nuts. They looked at each other, confused. It wasn't an insult they recognized. It wasn't a formal refusal. It wasn't anything they could neatly translate into military language. For a moment, the battlefield felt almost absurd. Thousands of men were frozen in place around Bastogne. Artillery waited, tanks waited, infantry waited, and here, at the center of it all, the official American response was a word. That sounded like something a child might say. One of the Germans finally turned to the American officer who had delivered the message and asked a simple question. "What does this mean?" The American hesitated, because nuts wasn't just a word. It was slang. A quick, sharp expression Americans used when something was ridiculous, or when someone was being outrageous. So the officer chose the closest meaning he could. He told them it meant, "Go to hell." That changed everything, because now the Germans understood. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was refusal, complete and absolute. And behind that refusal was something more dangerous than a line of foxholes. It was confidence. The Germans had expected fear. They had expected a trapped army begging for mercy. Instead, they were looking at a force that was still capable of mocking them, even while starving, even while freezing, even while surrounded. The officers folded the paper carefully and placed it back in their pocket. And for the first time, the Americans noticed something subtle in their posture. The calm certainty was gone. They still had the guns. They still had the numbers. But now they had a new problem. Because if the Americans in Bastogne could answer an ultimatum with sarcasm, then maybe they weren't broken yet. Maybe they weren't even close. The Germans turned and walked back into the snow. And as they disappeared into the trees, one thought spread through Bastogne like warmth. The enemy had blinked. After the ultimatum, the battle changed. Not on the maps, not on the outer perimeter. The Germans were still there. The Americans were still surrounded. The snow still fell. The cold still cut through everything. But something shifted inside Bastogne, because now the question of surrender was gone. It wasn't being debated in headquarters. It wasn't being whispered in foxholes. It wasn't even a thought. McAuliffe's one-word reply spread through the lines the way rumors always do in war, fast, half-believed at first, then repeated, then carried like a charm. Nuts. Men said it with a grin that cracked lips. They said it while cleaning frozen rifles. They said it while dragging ammunition crates through snow. They said it to each other when the shelling started again. It became a kind of password, not just a word, but a decision. And the Germans, furious and impatient, began to tighten the noose. Their artillery increased. Mortar rounds fell closer. Tank guns slammed into the defenses with a heavy, brutal rhythm. German infantry probed for weak spots, pushing into the woods, trying to find one section of the line thin enough to rip open. Sometimes they did. Sometimes an American position would bend. Sometimes a village on the edge of the perimeter would be lost for an hour, then taken back. The fighting became intimate, close enough to hear enemy voices, close enough to smell gunpowder hanging in the frozen air. And through it all, McAuliffe and his officers did what they could with what they had. Artillery fire was rationed by the mission. No wasting rounds, no firing unless a target was worth it. Every shell had to be a decision. They moved units like pieces on a board, shifting a company here, reinforcing a roadblock there, sending a handful of men to plug a gap that could widen into disaster. Sometimes the only reserve was a group of exhausted paratroopers who hadn't slept in 2 days. They went anyway. Because in Bastogne, every man knew the truth. If one part of the line collapsed, the whole ring could collapse with it. The wounded kept coming. Aid stations stayed full. Medics worked until their hands shook, and still the line held. Not because it was strong, not because it was comfortable, but because the men inside it had decided something. The Germans had brought an ultimatum. The Americans had brought an answer. And now Bastogne wasn't just defending a crossroads, it was defending an idea, that you could be surrounded and still refuse to surrender. For days, the sky had been a ceiling, a heavy lid of cloud and snow that trapped Bastogne in a frozen cage. And as long as that lid stayed shut, the Germans held one of their greatest advantages. The Americans inside the town could fight, they could hold, but they could not be resupplied, not by truck, not by road, and not by air. Then, on December 23rd, the world changed. It didn't begin with a sudden explosion or a dramatic announcement. It began with light, a thin break in the clouds, a faint, pale brightness sliding across the snow like a promise. Men looked up from their foxholes and saw something they hadn't seen in days: blue sky. At first, it felt unreal, like a memory. Then they heard it. A distant drone, not German engines, not tanks, aircraft. And as the sound grew louder, the Americans realized what it meant. The Allies were coming. Transport planes appeared first, low and steady, flying into the danger with parachutes packed inside their bellies. Then came the escorts, fighters slicing through the cold air, scanning for German guns. The first supply bundles dropped like falling stars, crates and bags tumbling down through the clear sky, parachutes snapping open, drifting toward the perimeter. Men ran through the snow to reach them. They tore them open with numb hands. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, bandages, morphine, everything Bastogne had been starving for. The relief wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Because the Germans saw it too. They watched the skies fill with Allied aircraft. They watched their advantage begin to slip. Then came the strike planes. Bombers and fighter bombers swept over the forests and roads around Bastogne, hitting German positions that had been safe in the clouds. They bombed artillery batteries. They strafed supply routes. They shattered concentrations of infantry and armor. And for the first time since the siege began, the Germans had to look upward. They had to take cover. They had to fight the air, not just the ground. Inside Bastogne, men who had been running on cold and rage suddenly felt something warmer. Hope, not the soft kind, not the kind that makes you relax, the hard kind, the kind that makes you grip your rifle tighter and say, "Now we can finish this." Because the siege had not ended yet. But the sky had opened, and with it, Bastogne was no longer alone. The supply drops bought time, the clear skies bought momentum, but Bastogne still needed one thing more than anything else: a road. Because as long as the town remained surrounded, every crate that fell from the sky was only a temporary answer. The real rescue had to come from the ground. And far to the south, one man was already driving his army. Through winter mud and enemy fire to make that happen, General George S. Patton. Patton commanded the U.S. Third Army, and when the German offensive began, he did something few commanders could do under pressure. He turned his entire army, not slowly, not over weeks, but in days. Columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry swung north, pushing through snow and ice, fighting through roadblocks, ambushes, and shattered villages. The Germans knew what Patton was trying to do, so they threw everything they could in his path. But Patton kept driving, because Bastogne was more than a town now. It was a symbol, and symbols cannot be allowed to fall. On December 26th, Patton's lead elements, armored spearheads, finally broke through the German lines and reached the defenders. The first tanks rolled into Bastogne like thunder. Men who had spent days in frozen holes stood up and watched them arrive, hardly believing what they were seeing. The siege wasn't instantly over. The fighting didn't stop overnight, but the ring was broken. A corridor was open. Bastogne could breathe again, and the Germans, who had promised annihilation, were forced to accept a truth they hated. The Americans had not surrendered. They had endured. And now they were no longer trapped. Bastogne was not the biggest battle of the war, but it became one of the most remembered, because history doesn't always choose the loudest moment. Sometimes it chooses the simplest one. A winter town surrounded by an enemy army. A commander handed an ultimatum, and a reply so short it could fit on a single line. Nuts. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a military phrase. It was a refusal, human, blunt, unmistakable. And that's why it mattered. Because in that one word, the defenders of Bastogne told the world something larger than strategy. They said, you can be cold, hungry, exhausted, and outnumbered, and still decide that surrender is not an option. The Germans came to Bastogne expecting fear. They left with uncertainty. And the Americans, still surrounded, still suffering, found something stronger than comfort. They found defiance. Years later, soldiers would still repeat that word, not because it was clever, but because it captured something timeless about war. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not artillery, not tanks, not aircraft. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the will to say no and mean it.